Picture this. Northern Ontario, Canada, 1892. A boy of 9 is watching his father die. Not slowly, not peacefully. The way farm men die, suddenly between one season and the next. A chest infection that the doctor in Sudbury said was nothing, and then everything. Walter Gibbons had cleared 40 acres of rock and spruce with his own hands. He had built the house, sunk the well, married a woman who could read Latin and chose not to brag about it. And on a Tuesday morning in February, with the temperature outside at 22 below, he was gone. The boy standing at the foot of the bed was named Eliot Gibbons. He did not cry. He looked at his father's face for a long moment, then walked to the window and stared at the birch trees. His mother would later say that something in Eliot changed that morning. Not broke, changed. Like iron going into a fire, the shape the same but something fundamental altered. What happened next is the most extraordinary story of faith, sacrifice, and hard mercy you have likely never heard. Eliot's mother, Constance Gibbons, was a woman built for difficulty. The daughter of a Presbyterian minister from Guelph, she had followed Walter north with nothing but a Bible, a sewing box, and the unshakable conviction that God does not make mistakes, even when it very much looks like he does. After Walter died, she did not sell the farm. She did not move back south to her parents. She planted the spring crop with Eliot beside her, a child too small to manage a full furrow, doing it anyway. She taught Eliot to read from the King James Bible because it was the book she had. She taught him arithmetic on a slate board. She told him, consistently and without apology, that the world would ask him to be less than he was, and that the correct response to this was to quietly become more. By the time Eliot was 14, he had read everything in the Sudbury Lending Library worth reading. By 16, he had a reputation in the Methodist congregation as someone who asked questions the minister couldn't always answer. Not with hostility, but with the genuine bewilderment of a person for whom faith and reason were not enemies, but failed to fully explain each other yet. At 17, Eliot left for Toronto to study at Victoria College. He had $42, a letter of introduction from his minister, and the absolute certainty, which would be tested many times, that he was supposed to be there. Have you ever felt that? A pull in a direction you couldn't entirely justify. Toronto in 1900 was a city of 500,000 people, horse trams, coal smoke, and the unmistakable smell of the lake in every season. For a boy from the bush north of Sudbury, it was almost incomprehensible. The buildings were tall. The noise was constant. The people moved with a purposefulness that seemed disconnected from anything growing or seasonal. Eliot studied theology, which surprised no one who knew him. What surprised people was what else he studied. Medicine, specifically the relationship between poverty and disease in the city's immigrant wards. He spent his evenings at a mission on Jarvis Street, not preaching, but doing something that in 1900 was considered slightly eccentric for a theology student. Listening. He listened to the Irish dockworkers with tuberculosis. He listened to the Italian women whose children had diphtheria. He sat with the old Ukrainians from the ward district who had come to Canada with nothing and were dying of it, slowly, in rented rooms the size of a large closet. He wrote home to his mother, "I am beginning to understand that the gospel is not something you bring to people. It is something you find together in the middle of what they are already going through." Constance wrote back, "That is either very wise or very naive. Ask God which one." In 1903, at the age of 20, Eliot graduated. He was offered a comfortable parish position in Rosedale. He turned it down. He applied instead to the China Inland Mission, and in September of that year, he boarded a ship in Vancouver heading west across the Pacific. He had never been on the ocean. He was sick for 11 days. He did not go back. China, in 1903, was a country 9 years past the Sino-Japanese War and 3 years past the Boxer Rebellion. In the complicated, uneasy period of the late dynasty, when everything was renegotiating itself and no one was entirely certain what would emerge, the missionary community was navigating this with varying degrees of wisdom. Some had built themselves small English Englands, with rose gardens and cricket pitches and a studied distance from everything local. Others had gone so native, as they said then, that they'd lost their anchor. Eliot arrived in Henan province and did neither. He learned Mandarin with the stubborn, unsentimental approach he brought to everything. drilling characters every morning before breakfast, hiring a local scholar named Chen Wei-liang to correct his tones, accepting correction without ego. Within 18 months, he was fluent enough to preach without an interpreter. Within 3 years, locals could understand him without effort, which was not a given. He also learned something else in those first years that would define everything that came after. He learned that faith without presence is a pamphlet, a nice document, interesting to read, easy to set aside. What moved people was not argument, it was witness, not the dramatic kind, not fire from heaven, not visions, not tongues, though he had no quarrel with those who experienced them, but the dailiness of someone who believed what they said they believed, who stayed when staying was hard, who didn't leave when the circumstances became uncomfortable. In 1906, there was an outbreak of cholera in the villages along the Yellow River tributary where Eliot worked. The other foreign missionaries evacuated. Their supervisors had protocols. The protocol said to leave. Eliot stayed. He stayed not because he was unafraid. He stayed because when he sat down to think about leaving, he could not make the logic work. The people he was supposed to serve were the people dying. The job he had signed on for was presence. And you cannot be present at a distance. For 6 weeks he went house to house with boiled water and rice congee and prayers that were sometimes desperate and sometimes almost wordless. Just a hand held, a forehead touched, the simple animal consolation of one human being not leaving another alone. 61 people died. 314 survived. No one could say with certainty that Eliot's work changed those numbers. But when the outbreak ended, the village elder of a small settlement called Liao Jiazhuang, a man named Liao Zhongqing, who had previously refused to let missionaries cross his threshold, walked to the mission compound and stood at the gate. He said in Mandarin. "You didn't go," Eliot said. "No." The old man nodded. He stood there another moment. Then he said, "My son has a fever. Will you come?" Eliot went. The son recovered. And over the next 2 years, something that felt less like a religious movement and more like a slow shift in trust spread through those villages. Quiet, undramatic, and deep. Back in Canada, no one was paying much attention. Mission newsletters carried small notices. Constance Gibbons read them at the kitchen table in the farmhouse north of Sudbury, added her son's name to the list of people she prayed for each morning, and went back to planting her beans. In 1909, Eliot was 26 years old, and a man he had never heard of before that year came to Hainan province and changed his life. The man's name was David Victor Holt. He was from Hamilton, Ontario, which felt almost comically close to home. He was 43, large, loud, exasperatingly confident, and had a way of arriving in a room that rearranged its furniture without touching anything. Holt had spent the previous decade in Korea and had come to China because, as he put it in his direct and slightly aggressive way, God had pointed at a map and put his finger on Hainan. The two men had almost nothing in common. Eliot was careful where Holt was impulsive. Eliot thought before speaking. Holt seemed to speak as a method of thinking. Eliot's faith was the deep, quiet kind, like groundwater. Holt's was volcanic, eruptions of certainty followed by ash. They became inexplicably the best of friends. Holt was also dying. He had known it for several months. The diagnosis, made in Shanghai by a German physician, was cancer of the stomach. He had perhaps a year. He had chosen to spend it in Hainan province, doing what he had always done, which was everything he possibly could as quickly as he could, without apology. Eliot watched Holt work through that year with an attention that was not entirely clinical. It was more like the way you watch a flame. Not because you want it to go out, but because you want to understand what it's made of. Holt had a habit of praying in a particular way. Not formally, not liturgically, more like a conversation with someone in the next room. Eliot, who had grown up with the ordered cadences of Presbyterian prayer, found this unsettling at first and then, gradually, revelatory. One evening, 6 months before the end, Holt said to him, "You know what the problem with you is?" Eliot said he was willing to hear it. Holt said, "You're waiting. You keep waiting for permission, for the right conditions. For someone to tell you that what you're seeing is real. But the thing is, Eliot, nobody's coming. You already know. You've known for years. You're just waiting for yourself to catch up." The night that Holt died, in October 1910, in a small room in Xinjiang, with Eliot holding his hand and the sound of rain on the tile roof, Eliot sat for a long time in the silence. After he did not pray formally, he sat. He breathed, and then he got up, washed his face, and went back to work. But something had shifted. The waiting was over. Over the next several years, Eliot Gibbons became a different kind of missionary, or rather, became more fully what he had always been pointing toward. He stopped organizing his work around programs and meetings and started organizing it around people. Specific people. He knew their names. He knew their children's names. He knew who was sick and who was feuding, and whose harvest had failed and whose roof was leaking. He had a particular gift with the sick, not miraculous in any way he could explain or wanted to explain. He was deeply wary of that language. It seems too many things that claimed miracle and collapsed under scrutiny. What he had was attention. He would sit with someone who was suffering and give them the whole of himself for the duration of that sitting. No partial presence, no monitoring the door for the next appointment. The full weight of another person's reality received without deflection. People talked about it in villages he hadn't visited yet. A Canadian man, they said. He sits with you, he stays. In 1913, Eliot met a woman. Her name was Anna-Lena Forsberg. She was from Winnipeg, Manitoba, the daughter of Swedish immigrants. And she had arrived in China 6 months earlier, with a medical nursing background, and the kind of organizational competence that made everything around her immediately more functional. She had reorganized the mission's supply chain within a month of arriving. She had introduced a system for tracking health outcomes in villages that Eliot had never thought to implement and immediately recognized as far superior to what he had been doing. He found her profoundly irritating in the way you find irritating the person who is clearly better at something you considered your area of strength. She found him, she later said, unnecessarily patient in a way that she initially mistook for weakness. They figured each other out slowly, the way people do when they are too busy to have a proper falling in love and do it sideways instead, in the margins of other work. A conversation over a typhoid case. An argument about methodology that turned into the first time either of them laughed properly in months. A walk back from a village in the failing light of a November afternoon, where they were halfway through a sentence about drainage before one of them, neither could remember which, reached for the other's hand. They were married in January 1914 in the mission compound in Zhengzhou, with a congregation of 40 Chinese Christians and 2 other Canadian missionaries, and a ceremony conducted half in English and half in Mandarin because it seemed wrong not to. The years that followed were good years, difficult years, both true at once. The work expanded. The community of villages where Eliot was known grew. Anna's medical work was saving lives in ways that were documentable and concrete. They had 2 children, a boy named Thomas, born 1915, and a girl named Ruth, born 1917. The First World War reached them only as news, which was its own particular disorientation. Reading in letters about a catastrophe happening on the other side of the world while surrounded by a country managing its own upheavals. The fall of the Qing dynasty. The Republic. The instability that followed. Eliot wrote home to Constance, who was now 71 and still on the farm. I am watching 2 great empires renegotiate themselves at the same time, from 2 different sets of news. It is like standing between 2 storms and trying to hold an umbrella, Constance wrote back. Just keep your boots dry. In 1919, the situation in Hunan province became dangerous. There were warlord conflicts, bandit raids on villages, a general lawlessness that the mission's parent organization in London was watching with alarm. They sent a strongly worded letter recommending evacuation of all personnel with children. Eliot read the letter. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long evening. Then he wrote back. He said, I understand the recommendation. I am aware of the risks. I am staying. Thomas and Ruth are staying. Anna has been consulted and has made her own decision, which is the same as mine. If you require our resignation to manage this from your end, we understand. The organization did not require his resignation. They also stopped sending supplies for the next 8 months, which was a different kind of message. That year, with no supply line and a region in active conflict, Eliot and Anna ran the mission on what the local community brought them, which was more than the London office had sent in years. Families brought rice. The old village elder Liao Zhongqing, who was by then 83 and nearly blind, arrived one afternoon with a goat. He handed it to Eliot without ceremony and said, "This is for the children." Eliot thought about a lot of things in that season. He thought about his father dying when he was 9, and about his mother planting the spring crop anyway. He thought about David Holt in his last months, spending everything he had without stockpiling any for some future that was not coming. He thought about what it actually cost to stay somewhere when leaving was available. He came to a conclusion that was not comfortable, and that he never quite figured out how to communicate without sounding either pious or reckless. He believed that the place where God puts you is the place where God intends to use you, and that reassignment, even reasonable, prudent reassignment, was sometimes just a more respectable name for retreat. In 1921, he was 40 years old, and a warlord's soldiers came through the villages. This is the part of the story that requires care in the telling, because it was not dramatic in the way stories are usually dramatic. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum, no moment where Eliot stood in a doorway and refused to move. What happened was smaller than that and harder than that. The soldiers came through 3 villages where Eliot was known. In each one, the village leaders had hidden their food stores. The soldiers were looking for grain, for money, for whatever was available. In 2 of the villages, the locals chose not to offer the mission compound's location. Not because they were asked to protect it. They weren't. But because the man who had stayed during the cholera outbreak and sat with their sick and known their children's names was, in that calculation, one of theirs. In the 3rd village, a frightened young man told the soldiers where the compound was. The soldiers arrived at dusk. There were 11 of them. Eliot met them at the gate with 2 lanterns and no weapon. Anna had taken the children to a neighbor's house. He did not know if that was the right decision. He made it anyway. What happened in the next hour is something Eliot wrote about only once, in a letter to a friend, and described as the most terrifying and clarifying experience of his life. The soldiers searched the compound. They took some medical supplies and a small amount of money from the emergency fund. They argued among themselves. Their commanding officer, a young man who could not have been more than 19, looked at Eliot for a long moment and said, in Mandarin, "Why are you still here?" Eliot said, "Because this is where I live." The officer looked at him. Something moved in his face that Eliot could not name. Then the soldiers left. Anna brought the children back at midnight. Thomas, who was 6, was furious at having been made to leave. Ruth, who was 4, had slept through the whole thing. Eliot sat at the kitchen table for a long time after everyone was asleep. He wrote in his journal, "I do not know if I was brave tonight or simply too tired to be afraid. I do not know if there is a difference." The rest of the 1920s were years of expansion and complication. The community of faith that had grown up around the mission in Henan was by 1927 something that could no longer be described as a mission. It was a church, or more accurately, a cluster of churches. With local leadership, local theology, local faces, Eliot had, over the previous 20 years, done the thing that many missionaries claimed to be doing, and relatively few actually did. He had built something that did not need him. In 1927, the political situation in China deteriorated rapidly with the Northern Expedition and the Shanghai Massacre. Virtually all foreign missionaries were evacuated. This time, Eliot left. He left because the local church leaders asked him to. Not because they didn't want him there, but because his presence had become a liability in a way that his absence would not be. That request, he would later say, was the hardest thing he had ever been asked. Harder than the cholera outbreak. Harder than the soldiers at the gate. To be sent home by the people you had given your life to, because you were now a complication they couldn't afford. That was a particular kind of grief without a clean name. He and Anna and the children returned to Canada in the spring of 1927. Thomas was 12. Ruth was 10. They arrived in Vancouver and took the train east. Eliot had not seen Canada in 6 years. The country looked impossibly clean to him, impossibly easy. The produce in the market windows, the width of the streets, the silence at night that was not the silence of danger but just silence. His mother met them in Toronto. Constance Gibbons was 83 years old, had outlived most of her contemporaries, and had opinions about everything. She looked at her son, 44 years old, thinner than when he'd left, with a stillness about him that was new, and said without preamble, "You look like you need to eat something." He did. She fed him. They sat at the kitchen table, and she asked him to tell her everything. And he did, until 2 in the morning, and she listened the way she had always listened. Without interrupting, without offering solutions, with the full weight of her attention, which was where Eliot had learned it from. In 1928, the mission organization asked Eliot to speak in churches across Canada to report on the work and raise funds. He agreed with some reluctance. Public speaking about his own life felt uncomfortably close to self-promotion, and self-promotion was in the hierarchy of sins Constance Gibbons had constructed for her son, somewhere near the top. But the tours continued, and something unexpected happened. People listened, not the polite listening of congregations enduring a missionary report before getting to the potluck. They leaned forward. They asked questions afterward that suggested they had actually heard what he said. An old man in a church in Kitchener came up to him afterward and stood there for a moment and said, "I lost 2 sons in the war, and I stopped believing God was paying attention. What you said tonight is the first thing that has made me think maybe he is." Eliot drove back to Toronto that night and sat in the car outside the house for 20 minutes before going in. He had been in China for 24 years. He had learned Mandarin and built churches, and sat with the dying and faced soldiers at a gate in the dark. And a conversation in a church basement in Kitchener about grief and presence had moved him more than almost any of it. He wrote to Anna that night. She had stayed home with the children, who were in school now and needed the stability. And he said, "I think I misunderstood the calling. I think I thought it had an address. I think it's bigger than that." The return to China came in 1930. The political situation was never fully stable, but it had reached a state that the mission organization considered manageable, which was their way of saying it was bad but not catastrophically bad. Eliot went back. Anna went with him. Thomas, 15, stayed in Canada to finish secondary school. Ruth, 13, came with them. Ruth was extraordinary. She had grown up between 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 ways of being in the world, and rather than being fragmented by this, she had become something more like doubled. She spoke Mandarin with the accent of the villages where she had grown up, not the stilted classroom Mandarin of foreigners. She moved through the compound and through the village markets with an ease that Eliot watched with something close to awe. She also had her mother's organizational brain and her father's habit of sitting with people in difficulty, and she was at 13 already doing both. The 1930s in China were catastrophic. The Japanese invasion in 1937 changed everything. The mission area was in the path of the advance, and once again evacuation was ordered. This time, Eliot left without being asked. He had learned, finally, the difference between staying because you should and staying because you couldn't bring yourself to leave. This time was the former. The church was real. It was local. It would survive without him, had been built to survive without him, and his staying would put people at risk who had already given everything. He and Anna and Ruth left in September 1937. They were among the last missionaries out of Henan province. Ruth, 20 years old, spent the train journey east making lists of the families she was worried about. The practical things the local church would need to manage without external supply lines. The names of the children she had been teaching. She left her notebook with a local pastor at the last station before the coast and said, "These are the people. Don't lose the list." Eliot watched this and did not say anything. There was nothing to add. They returned to Canada permanently in 1938. Eliot was 55. Anna was 51. They settled in Hamilton, Ontario, close enough to Toronto to access the mission offices, far enough from the center of things to have a garden. Constance Gibbons had died the previous year at 89 in the farmhouse north of Sudbury. Eliot had not been there. He had received the telegram a week after, which was the way of things. He had sat with it for a day and then written her a letter anyway, to her address, to the farm, that he never sent. He kept it in his Bible. The letter said, "You gave me everything I needed, and you did it in such a quiet way that I didn't fully understand that you were doing it. I still don't think I understand all of it. But I am trying to become what you believed I could be." The war years in Canada were strange years for Eliot. He was too old to serve and not quite settled enough to feel at home. He spoke in churches when asked, wrote reports for mission journals, consulted with people preparing to go overseas. He gardened. He and Anna attended a small Presbyterian congregation near their house in Hamilton, where nobody particularly knew who he was, which was restful. In 1943, a letter arrived from China. It had been routed through 3 countries and was nearly a year old by the time it reached them. It was from Chen Wei Liang, the scholar who had corrected Eliot's Mandarin tones 40 years earlier. Wei Liang was 81. The letter was in Chinese. He had heard Eliot was back in Canada. He wanted him to know the churches were still there. The war was terrible, but they were there. The people were still meeting. Some of the children Eliot had known were now the leaders. One of the women who had been healed during the cholera outbreak in 1906 had just died at the age of 79 and had asked that Eliot be told if it could ever be arranged. Eliot read the letter 3 times. Then he took it to Anna, who read it and did not say anything, which was the right response. The post-war years brought a particular grief. China fell to communist rule in 1949, and the churches that had survived the Japanese invasion were now navigating a new and different kind of pressure. Contact became increasingly difficult. Letters stopped arriving. The community Eliot had spent his life building was behind a door he could no longer open. He never spoke about this with bitterness. He spoke about it sometimes, with a kind of theological observation that was perhaps the most honest thing he ever said publicly, that you do not own what you build with God. The fruit belongs to the people it grows among. The work was never his, and if it could survive and grow in conditions he couldn't reach and couldn't control, that was the point, wasn't it? That was the whole point. He retired from formal mission work in 1950. Ruth, by then 33, was working as a nurse in Toronto. Thomas was in Vancouver, an engineer with 3 children who called their grandfather on the telephone every Sunday. Eliot found the telephone somewhat miraculous and slightly suspicious, which was his relationship with most modern technology. He and Anna spent the decade quietly. They had a routine, morning prayer, which was still more conversation than liturgy, garden, letters. In the afternoons, Eliot read, voraciously, undiscriminatingly, with the same hungry attentiveness he had always brought to other people's minds. He read theology, obviously, but also history and biology, and, toward the end of the 1950s, the first books about DNA, which he found almost unbearably interesting. He said once to Ruth, who had driven down to spend a weekend, "I spent 60 years watching the body of Christ work in the world, and now they are telling me there is another body, inside every cell of everything that lives, that works in the same way, invisibly, in patterns we can barely read, building something that outlasts the individual parts. I think that is either a coincidence or it isn't." Ruth said, "I think it isn't." He smiled. He had her mother's directness. He had always been grateful for it. Eliot Gibbons died on a Thursday morning in March 1962 at the age of 79 in the house in Hamilton. Anna was in the room. Ruth was on her way from Toronto. She arrived 3 hours later. Thomas came by plane from Vancouver the following day. He had been ill for 6 months. Not dramatically. A series of small failures, the way bodies negotiate their own endings. He had stayed himself throughout it, asking questions, reading when he had the energy, wanting to know what was happening in the world, particularly about China, which was always China, which was always the place his mind returned. In his last week, he said to Anna, on an ordinary afternoon, that he had been thinking about his father dying when he was 9, and about the birch trees outside the window of the farm, and about the way he hadn't cried. He said he still didn't fully understand that boy. What had he known, standing at that window? What had he been deciding? Anna said, "I think he was deciding to stay." Eliot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that sounds right. The churches in Henan province that Eliot helped build are still there. Not in the form he left them. They have changed, adapted, survived things he never anticipated, been reshaped by hands he never met. But they are there." The records kept by Anna and then by Ruth made it possible, decades later, for researchers to trace some of the lineage. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to know the nape of what grew. A note in one of those records, found in Ruth's papers after her own death in 1994, was written in Mandarin in what researchers dated to the 1950s. The handwriting is not identified. It says in rough translation, "The Canadian man who stayed, We did not always understand him, but he stayed. And because he stayed, we knew that someone had decided we were worth staying for. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing.